First of all, I want to welcome everybody today to the NAWI webinar entitled From Lab to Scale, Commercializing Water Solutions in 2022. My name is Matt Ringer. I am the Partnership Director for the National Alliance for Water Innovation, and I'm excited that you're all here today to hear our four panelists discuss this important topic. We were supposed to have Peter Fisk here as well, our Executive Director, but he's had some personal issues that he has to take care of, so he will not be able to join us today. With that being said, we have four great people here to really talk about this important area. So before we get started, my colleague Ryan, for those of you that have been on this, know Ryan right now, but Ryan has a couple of logistical things before we go into the discussion.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Ingwerson. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'll be the Zoom host for today's meeting. Please note this meeting is being recorded and we will post it online on the NAWI Alliance community website as soon as possible after the event. Everyone is joined in listen-only mode. That means you will be muted throughout the duration of the presentation. That said, we do absolutely welcome your questions and we ask that you submit those in the chat box and we will address those throughout the presentation. If you are having any audio issues, please try connecting through your phone first, or if you have any continuing issues or any other technical issues, please feel free to send me a chat and I will happily assist you with that. And with that, I'll turn things back over to Matt to introduce our speakers.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And just to confirm, we are recording right now, right, Ryan?
Yes.
Good, okay. So again, welcome today to our panel discussion. We have four speakers with us today, and I'd like to introduce them before we talk a little bit about the panel today. First, we have Scott Bryan, President of Imagine H2O. Imagine H2O works with water startup entrepreneurs, and Scott is also a member of the NAWI Innovation Commercial and Commercialization Council. So thanks for being here, Scott. Second, we have Dr. Eric Hoke, professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA. Nobody's probably said it that way in a long time. But Eric is our deputy topic area lead on process innovation or process intensification and innovation. And also he is a member of the Innovation and Commercialization Council. Thirdly, we have Hatem Fons. He's a strategic relationship manager at Chevron Technology Ventures and is also the chair of the Innovation and Commercialization Council for NAWI. And finally, joining us on his first webinar with us is Dr. Rich Stover, Vice President of Technology at Gradient Corporation. And we're excited to have Rick join us today. So let's dive right into the topics here. And just for a short effort or a short description of what we'd like to accomplish in the discussion today. We've organized it to address three important issues. The first is the state of water innovation today, where things exist, where there's been some success. Second is a summary of opportunities and resources available to NAWI members. And third, a little bit about common mistakes to avoid in the process of moving through innovation. Kind of innovation and commercialization. So the first thing we want to start with is success. It's nice to kind of get things started with talking about how things have worked well. And I'd like to start having Eric talk a little bit about Nano H2O and how that kind of moved from the lab into the commercialization space. So Eric, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of thought with us there.
Sure. So I mean, the whole Nano H2O story is like a series of if anything could go right, it did from the very beginning. So I had submitted proposals to NSF, EPA, Office of Naval Research, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, with this idea of putting nanoparticles into the coating film of narrow membrane. And all four of the proposals from these four different esteemed agencies, came back with reviews that, ranged from this is the stupidest idea I've ever heard, it'll never work, to even if it does work, you can't, beat the current state of the art. They're already good enough. And so why bother? And so I ignorantly decided to self-fund it. And we started synthesizing nanoparticles, putting them into the coating films, and got like 40% higher water permeability with the same rejection. And thought, hey, maybe we got something. So we filed a patent, wrote a paper. It was a nice paper, and got some interest from some investors who had been associated with UCLA through the business school some years earlier. The founders of Stamps.com and then some other companies were kind of then in a position to seed a startup and invest and lead a startup in the water space. So that's how I met Jeff Green and Jim McDermott, Bob Burke, who was the chief scientific officer. And it was, I get a call from a guy in the tech transfer office, and he says, I got some people interested in talking to you, and you want to talk to them? I was like, yeah, sure, send them. So Bob Burke and Jim McDermott come to my office, and they don't ask me about myself. They ask me about another technology. I'm not going to tell anybody whose technology it was, but what do you think about this technology? And my conclusion was basically, well, it's probably going to be niche. It's not really going to scale beyond this niche place. This is where it belongs in sort of the whole ecosystem, and but it'll work, right? And so they said, okay, well, tell us about what you're doing, and I did, and they said, okay, let's start a company after about 20 minutes. So I was like, okay, never done that before. So a couple weeks later, I meet Jeff Green. He's going to be the CEO with Bob Burke and Jim. Everybody gets along real well, and they say, okay, what's the goal? And I said, well, within 2 years, let's try to make a membrane that's 2 times more permeable than the state of the art. And I said, I think we can. And they were very focused on seawater. I actually wanted to go after like brackish water and wastewater, because the membranes that we were making were remarkably fouling resistant, at least as we were testing them in the lab. And you could run them at higher fluxes than other membranes and very little flux decline. And I thought the fraction of energy associated with fouling and scaling and brackish water, municipal wastewater is huge. You can double your feed pressure in a matter of months. But in seawater, you're only going to go from 900 to 1,000, right? So the fractional savings is much less. But they wanted seawater, they wanted 2x. And this was in January, maybe February 2005. So the project starts September 1st, and they come to my office, and they sit down and they say, how's it going, whatever. And I say, well, I got good news and bad news. And they say, okay. I said, the good news is I already have a membrane that's 2x the flux of a membrane without nanoparticles. And they start laughing. They said, well, what's the bad news? I said, now you guys got to figure out how I'm going to spend the rest of your money. So it was just like before we even got started, we had the solution, right? And then we spent a couple years in the lab, and then they moved into an incubator, and then they moved down to El Segundo. But one of the things, whether it's the nano story of other membrane companies, Polycera, which scaled for a while and then we sold it off, in every case, in my personal experience, we spent too much time in the lab. We were trying to make a hand-casted flat sheet, near to perfect. And as soon as you go to contract manufacturer, a lot of stuff changes. And so really what you need to know is if it's a membrane that's you're going to make by a phase inversion, can you take the polymer, put it in a regular solvent, and phase invert it with water? If you can do that, that's all you need to know. Go to contract manufacturing right away. Don't mess around in the lab. If it's a coating film, if you can spray coat it, dip coat it, or interfacially polymerize it, as soon as you know that the chemistry works in any of those modes, which are standard roll-to-roll, just go straight to manufacturing. All right? And then you're going to have to iterate off the line and back in the lab and off the line and back in the lab. But if you spend 2, 3, 4 years trying to perfect this thing by hand, and then you go to manufacturing scale, and everything's going to change anyway. So that's, I'd say, one of the lessons learned from all that experience.
Thanks, Eric. I have one quick question for you. So as the person who kind of discovered the technology, what was your role in the startup in its initial phase? were you, because you said they brought in a COO or a CEO, did you stay on as a research officer?
So I was untenured at the time. I was only about 3 years into being an assistant professor, and they don't grant leaves of absence to assistant professors, only if you're tenured. So I worked out a deal with Jeff and Bob and Vinod Khosla, who was our Series A financier, that I would serve as a consultant. I would make myself available to the extent that we're allowed to do work outside the university, about 1 day a week, that I would give all of that time to Nano H2O.
Okay.
And they thought it was good enough for the first couple of years. After 2-3 years, they had 25-30 people. They didn't need me anymore.
Right. Right. Which is common for as these things go. Just because it gets the idea doesn't mean you're in the company longer term.
Well, there's a conflict where if they're doing something and I know about it, the chemistry or something unique in the process, because of that consulting relationship, I'm held to confidentiality, and so I can't take those ideas and pursue them in my own lab independently in any
Right.
way, compromise that relationship. So there was a point at which Jeff and I think CJ Kurth, we sat down, and it might have been Bob, and they were like, "Do you want to know what we're doing?" And I was like, "I don't think I want to know anymore. Like, let me just come in and help troubleshoot on like the fouling and the pilot testing and that kind of stuff. And you guys, if you really need my help, you come to me. But otherwise, I don't want to know."
It's another really good learning. I think that's an aspect that people don't always think about when these things evolve out. So Rick, I know you had we're going to talk about ERI, which was a bootstrap company that you worked on, and just talk a little bit about it, and if the experience was similar or different from Eric, any learnings that you guys took out of that.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah. So I've worked for 4 water startups. 3 of them they're deemed a success and 1 a failure. I would say I learned as much from the failures as I did from the successes. But our focus here in this first question is on successes. Yeah, I say there are some similarities with Eric's story with several of the companies I've worked with, especially the concept of stopping work in the lab and handing it over to manufacturing. The phrase for that is kill the engineer. So, and as an engineer, I've always been a little averse to that phrase, but that's the concept. You have to lock it down and hand it over to manufacturing at some point. But yeah, so I'll talk about 2 specific briefly startups. ERI is a Energy Recovery Inc. It's a California-based specialty pump manufacturer. Started in 1987 on bootstrap. So, a guy with a great idea and a first stage invention. Lessons learned from ERI is one, it's going to take a while. So first money in to first money out. And by the way, ERI was a successful NASDAQ IPO in 2008, $600 million NASDAQ on about 60 million of earnings. So terrific performance financially. But that took 20 years. First money in to first money out was 20 years. The other part of that was just managing revisions. And this touches a little bit on what Eric's talking about. We had to do revisions, but everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. Dozens of revisions in-house before we went out to the market and several revisions afterwards. I'd say if you read the literature on ERI, a lot of the success is attributed to marketing and its approach to market. And I'll touch on that a little bit later in the talk. I do want to talk about Gradient, company I'm working with now, because there's a little bit of some different lessons there. The company came out with an oil field water treatment technology, very robust, used for produced water, frac water, arguably the worst water in the world. Oily salt water. Eric's got some background in this too. It's terrible stuff to work with. But we perfected a desalination technology for that in our first opportunities. And then the bottom fell out of the market. Nobody wanted to do desalination of produced water, frac water in 2013, 2014 when we were ready to commercialize. But we had to, in order to make that work, develop softening technologies. So precipitation removal, most of which actually weren't patented, sort of conventional off the shelf, but we had to bring them together, with the desalination platform. And it turned out that the market wanted that, even through the gas glut and even through the time. And so the company pivoted. So we set our desalination approach aside, and we started bringing the softening platform to market. And later on, we found great places to go with the desalination technology. But the two lessons learned there is, one is sometimes you've got to pivot. I mean, you have a great idea. It's great to have a plan, but you got to keep your eyes and ears open and shift to what the market needs. And that may be a completely different mindset, maybe a completely different management staff to make that happen. And then second is, don't be too hung up on your ego about your intellectual property. If you're going to be a solutions provider, you can go ahead and use conventionals. Other people have good ideas. And if you can bring that into your customer solution, that is your customer solution. Sure, patent what you can, but chances are you're going to need a lot more than what you can think of. So.
Yeah, that's a great point, the patenting thing. And I know that at a national lab, for example, a patent is just a patent, right? It's a way to put a fence around an idea.
Hunting license.
Yep. It takes much more than just one idea to make these things go through, and usually takes ideas, like you said, from even outside your own group to make it go forward. And I think that was one of the big learnings that I had when we looked at stuff here at NREL on commercializing technology. So let me flip to the other side now, looking at Scott, who's done more on the coming in and looking at ideas and starting up the companies. And a couple of things that you guys have looked at that have been successful, Scott. There's a couple. I know there's Membrion and a couple other folks, but what could you share about that and some perspectives from more of the the investor and maybe the incubator type or accelerator type perspective to this stuff?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the intro. And for folks that don't know us, Imagining Show is actually a nonprofit that envisions and builds solutions with the world's best water entrepreneurs. Since 2009, we've supported over 165 water startups, and collectively they've gone on to raise over 850 million in early stage investment. So we've really become kind of a natural stopping point for investors and customers who are looking for what's next in water. We have a no equity model, so we're actually pretty founder friendly and supported by philanthropies and corporate partners. Yeah, we've had the fortune to work with a number of companies in the wastewater space, like Membrion out of University of Washington, Aquacycle, which I think has its roots to USC, Zwitterco at Tufts. On the infrastructure side, Zilper, which was out of MIT. Less relevant to folks on the call today, but I think an interesting story that I've been thinking about this week is a company called Arable Labs, which started at Princeton. The founder had studied or worked on low-cost weather sensors for farmers in, I think, Kazakhstan. It was funded by the USAID. Several years later, this is basically a solar-powered sensor that sits in the field that helps reduce water through irrigation, but then also through food waste. But they just closed this $40 million Series C led by Tom Steyer's New Climate Fund. So we've definitely seen the gamut of entrepreneurs from campus and watching their success over time. And we've also worked with several internationally. But I would say, yeah, we've seen some common mistakes, and some of them seem all too classic. Especially when there are multiple founders at a university, maybe a professor and a student, they haven't tightened up that IP, and that leads to real heartbreak and frustration for all. So I think being really clear, working with your tech transfer office and others to really have a clear strategy to clear that up. But obviously, I think we can get into this. It really begins with the business model and the team. Those are paramount and sometimes more important than the technology. And sometimes that can be hard for folks in the university setting to get beyond that. But I think there are plenty of great stories out there and case studies, a lot of them available in podcasts. If you want to hear Andrew Benedict talk about Xenon and kind of what they went through, go crazy. It's a lot of information out there. And I think that's a benefit to you all that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, that there are a lot more stories and people that you can turn to as advisors, experts, and even investors that bring value to the table.
Yeah, and what you make me think of a couple things. Or one of the things is how do you, and this goes to Rick too. What do the customers really want? So how do you get to actually talk to them and understand what their real needs are? There was a great story that I remember from. I think it was one of the LabCore or Energy I-Core type things. Was the guy who originally created the Palm Pilot, and now I am dating myself because I know what a Palm Pilot is. Actually went out and walked around the street with a wooden model of the thing and asked people what they thought about it. Does it fit in your hand? Does it do all this thing? I thought that what great customer discovery, being able to understand what these people really want. And so anyways, just kind of a side story there. And Gautam, just shifting to you for a sec on this same topic. Obviously, CTV is a strategic investor. You tend to come on a little bit later on in the investing cycle. Anything that you can talk about some successes that you've had, things that have worked really well from your perspective?
Sure, you have to unmute my phone. Hey, thanks, Matt, and thanks for the introduction, and hello to everyone. So just a brief background, and as a part of introduction, CTV, that's Chevron Technology Ventures. It's a part of Chevron. And what we do actually is we look outside Chevron, external to Chevron, for innovation, with the idea being that innovation happens everywhere. And basically, if there's innovation that can find solutions for us, we're happy to support and sort of build on it. And traditionally, our route has been through venture capital. And as Matt referred to, is we typically get in late in the process, typically Series A, Series B. But over the last few years, I mean, we've been in this corporate venture capital for about 20 years now. We are one of the oldest oil and gas CVCs in this. I mean, there are a lot of lessons learned in terms of what are the hurdles, what works, what doesn't work. And looking at that, I mean, the biggest challenge has been, okay, how do we get some of the good technologies out of the national labs and universities into the commercial space? And basically, that's what we're talking about, right? From lab to commercialization. And looking at our experience and what we've actually done is devised a program called Chevron Studio, which addresses this very problem in terms of how can we get the IPs and the from the universities and national labs and help them commercialize. And the way this program works is that we reach out to the national labs, universities, we reach out to the entrepreneurs out there, and we do some matchmaking where we match the entrepreneurs with the IP, and then we provide some seed funding to the entrepreneurs. And then the entrepreneurs work with the national labs or the universities, wherever the IP is from, and scale these technologies up. And when they scale it up, and then they are then ready to stand on their own feet and raise their money. So this is a program that we've just launched. In fact, we finished the first cohort. We finished the applications for the first cohort. But again, this program is launched along with the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, sorry. And we are all excited, but I thought this was a very relevant thing because this is a problem that we do recognize. It's a tough problem and difficult to solve. And we are always trying to find tools that can help solve this, right?
Mm-hmm. That's great. And we're excited to be working with you guys on this and love to see where it all goes. These models of, engagement with national labs in non-traditional ways have been pretty successful, and we're excited to keep looking at them. In the end, the impact is how do we get more of these things out to the customers that really need them? And even if it's just a piece of the pie, like we were talking about, it's still an important piece of the pie. Yeah. So and leveraging all the resources that are out there. So all right, let me shift. I know we had some questions coming in on the chat, and I promise you we will get to these, but I want to kind of run through a few other things. So we've talked about successes, we've talked about some experiences that were very successful, and we've talked about the different kind of models that people have looked at from both the idea side and then the investor side. But let's shift a little bit and look at the harder things, like what are the biggest challenges that people face? And like Rick said, he said, I've been involved with 4 startups and 1 was successful, right? I think that's a pretty standard way that this would work. Or one spun out a little bit.
Yeah, happily the other way around. But I think the general track record is more like 1 out of 4 if you're lucky.
So I listened to you incorrectly. You've had 3 that have actually worked pretty well.
Good luck.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
I end up on a
Yeah.
panel, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, Eric.
Rick's got a Hall of Fame batting average for sure.
Well, I mean, but luck is part of it, right? I mean, you have to
Oh,
have
yeah.
some of that.
And by the way, the one that failed after he left. So he should probably be like 3-0-1. Maybe let's call it a tie.
I love that. Well,
And it did
okay.
not
So
fail.
even
It didn't fail because of technology. It failed because of people, and that is often people is a bigger problem than market, than technology, than customer. Risk aversion. The people that you put together to build a business can make it or break it.
Yeah, and I guess Rick, when you look at that the difference between the two, and maybe Eric hit on it, is the difference between the 3 and the one that failed. Was it around the people more or anything else, or was it what was the aspect of it that didn't work in the end?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on one concept, this having a plan but keeping your eyes open and being willing to pivot along the way, and I think that's been one mark of success or a mark of failure if you're sort of stuck on a specific idea or a specific thing. I think honestly the most common mistake is tied to people too, and it's you think if you come up with a really good idea that saves energy, saves money, saves, great, but they're not going to line up at your door for it. No matter what, you have to sell it, and in selling into water is really, really difficult. The number one need in water is barely ever articulated, which is reliability. So nobody wants to come in and fix your treatment system on the weekend, when they want to be home. It's reliability is tantamount. And so if you're bringing new tech, if there's any risk whatsoever, there's a lot of adversity to adopting that. And, so just figuring out, navigating around that big challenge of reliability, partnering with your customer, helping, making them understand, look, we're working on this together. It's not perfect, but I'm going to be here until it's running right, so I can go home. So I think that reliability thing is something you got to keep in mind. So.
Well, and that's a little bit. I mean, having that. The connection, you have to have reliable technology and then a connection to the customers to make it work.
Yeah.
So Scott, when you look at like the movement or the role that kind of the accelerator, not accelerator incubator type, how can you help some startup companies, and how do you help them identify those things to make it a more streamlined approach?
Yeah, definitely we focus on the people piece, and especially with solutions coming out of universities and having an honest conversation. Are you cut out to be the CEO, even though you invented this? There are some rare examples of great people who come from academia that end up being great CEOs. There's also a whole world of people that specialize. They are kind of CEOs for hire that work with university spinouts. And I think looking at that resource, even if you bring them on as advisors or mentors, that's where we're going to bring those kinds of perspectives in. So whoever the founder is, they can see what resources they're going to need from a human perspective from the team. And to Rick's point, if this is a 20-year journey, you really need to have the right people in place that are ready for that journey. Plenty of people are not patient enough for that. So really thinking long-term about your own personal life, what you want out of this, and who you want to surround yourself with is so critical at the early stage.
And one thing that you said connects me to something that Eric had talked about early on. You had people who came in with Nano H2O, and they had a group already ready to work with you, right? So they had kind of the CEO connection and those people who knew how to run companies, right, Eric?
Yeah, so I think I said on the panel we had, or I gave a talk or something a few weeks ago, one of the brilliant things, so Jeff Green was an amazing CEO. I mean, truly, he's one of the best, and I would work with him 100 times again. where they assessed the market, that there was a need, and the need they were clued into because Jim McDermott was investing in distressed assets in the power industry. And they kept finding in the power industry that water is a big problem. And so they said, okay, well, let's look into water. And they looked at water broadly and they focused in on desalination. They had a couple of kind of hallmarks of a potentially disruptible market. There were 3 or 4 major players. The technology was 30 years mature, and there hadn't been major innovations. There have been minor incremental things. I think ERI is probably the most important, impactful energy saving innovation in the last 40 years. They're high efficiency herds. But what they saw was there were a number of installations, small seawater desalination plants in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean that were old. They were still running old cellulose acetate membranes from the 80s, and they just keep buying from the same company, the same membranes. And the performance delta was huge. And so they could go in and they could offer, in this really niche market, they could offer the product, they could over warranty it, they would guarantee to replace their membranes with whoever's membranes the customer chose as part of their warranty. And they established a beachhead that way. I think in the first, probably not until after it was acquired by LG, did they have an actual salesperson based in the US. Nick Diner was the VP of Sales and Marketing. He was in LA, but he was going all over the world. So, long answer to, start by understanding the market. And then what they did was they went around to universities and national labs and they looked for a technology that they thought could feed into the market that they had identified as being potentially disruptible. And I think that was one of the real geniuses of how they went about the creation of Nano H2O. And I was kind of along for the ride. Yeah, it was my tech, I invented it. But from a business perspective, the genius was all Jeff, Jim, and Bob. And when they brought in CJ and Kurth and some other folks, it really started to kind of snowball from there.
And that sales and marketing strategy is a really important part. And I know, Rick, you had mentioned that this is kind of when you went on the 20-year journey, it was a key aspect of yours. What can you talk about with what people should think about in considering those, the sales marketing side of it, beyond just the technology?
Yeah, I mean, guarantee performance, crucial, kind of whatever it takes to make your customer comfortable. Being there on site till it works and not leaving until it does, and really following through, and whatever that takes. I think that who you select as your early adopters is really key. So what ERI was quite successful with was finding, I call them missionary early adopters. So these were folks who were willing to testify that the product worked in their application, and who were willing, you attended conferences and were willing to come out and say, yeah, we had success with this. And we made sure that happened. And sort of along with that is, you've got to have marketing clauses in whatever your contracts are that you can actually talk about your successes. So that's really key. Third-party validation like that. I think where Gradient, my company now, is really taking the next step in that has been use of performance contingent pilot contracts. So what that means is a piloting deal that says, if this pilot is successful by these key performance indicators, we will buy a commercial system of this size. There's always outs and loopholes in that. If the performance isn't exactly what they want, they don't have to follow through with it. But the intent is that you're going to follow through with a commercial product. And that contract, that you have that, is validating and marketable. So key. So if you can, it's not easy to get those, but if you can put one of those in place, that's really a help bridge that valley of death. That's the key.
Okay. So Fatima, one thing I wanted to chat about with everyone, as the chair of the Innovation and Commercialization Council, it works with me in the partnership side. How do people reach out? And I mean, because there's such great experience here, obviously, with the panelists here today, but what are some ways that people can utilize the ICC or potentially other aspects of NAWI to help them kind of understand where they could go with an innovation they consider?
Sure. No, thanks, Matt. Thanks for this. Just to add on one point, which I think Rick and Eric and Scott have been sort of this. I mean, I think just wanted to emphasize the people aspect of any startup, right? I mean, from our perspective, I mean, as I said, we've been doing this venture capital. The first thing we look at is who are the people, not what is the technology, right? Do we have the right people? Is it the right management? And that is so important. We've seen in terms of success of the company, that just wanted to sort of highlight that a bit. But
thanks, Autumn.
But again, so we have this Innovation and Commercialization Council, and I basically wanted to invite everyone on the council in terms of this. Who we have on the council, I mean, there's lots of experience on the council, right from the industry. We have representatives from the mining industry. We have reps from the oil and gas. We have experience on the venture capital side. We have experience on the R&D side. So we have this huge talent out here on the council. And I invite everyone to make use of that council. You have ideas, you have developed the basic science. I mean, we focus more on the scale up and commercialization aspects. So if you have done your basic science, you have the technology, and you're looking, okay, what's next and how do I scale this up? Where do I take this? Even if you're slightly earlier, so that you start thinking about those things, feel free to contact us. I think you can contact Jennifer, and she can set up this. We meet every quarter, and you can come and make presentations in front of the council and get feedback from the council. That'll be, and this is all free advice, right? So nothing like it.
Yeah. But we pulled it together because we thought this was really important to have this
just
kind
remember,
of feedback as an early stage. Yeah,
you might be getting what you paid for.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, but in the end, we all, I mean, there's a lot of the ICC and the partnership and alliance side of NAWI is about making sure that the innovations can have an impact longer term. I mean, there is a role for science and early stage innovation to make discovery. There's also a role for seeing some of these important discoveries see the light of day in the commercial space. And you know, the partnership side is really focused around how do we take the things that are promising and help guide their movement through. So anyways, what I'd like to do now, guys, if you don't mind, is I just want to go through some of the questions that people have put in here, and I'll just ask you a couple and see who wants to jump in and say it. And the first one is, what is your advice for engineers to work with technology companies and implement in a project more than just selling, more like consulting selling? Is there a good relationship agreement between the engineer and the technology provider? Anyone have some a good response to this particular question?
It's a little confusing, the wording. Yeah. Maybe you could put it in a nutshell. How do you read that, Matt?
Sorry, yeah, could you read that again?
So what it looks like to me is they're going to sell. They want to be a consultant, and they want to figure out how they can, as an engineer, be a consultant and kind of help the company, you know, make technology decisions.
Yeah,
that's how I read it.
Yeah. Well, it's tough. Again, super conservative market. I think there's not, you know, any specific approaches that always work. Probably, you know, nothing talks like experience. So, I mean, if you can bring really wisdom from, you know, lessons learned the hard way, lessons learned through success, you know, into the conversation, that can really be an asset. And part of that is really learning and listening from what's going on in the industry. So.
Yeah, the consulting world is an interesting one because in the end, it's all about listening to what somebody, really understanding what somebody wants, right? Which is more about asking questions and listening than anything else. Let's see here. So another question is, all right, IP. So intellectual property often seems to be a hindrance to the speed of commercialization. Hindrance may be a word, but it is something you always have to consider. Can any of you comment on a good way to balance speed and IP value and maximizing intellectual property value?
It's very difficult to raise money if you don't have a patented or a patent pending technology, right? Just an idea, because the investor, the first question they're going to ask you or in their due diligence is, who else out there could do this? Who has the capability of doing this? And if it's not protected, and there's a handful of folks that could actually pull it off, almost impossible to get that money. You might be able to get friends and family money, but not institutional money. So it's critical, I think, in making that step into the bigger, capital raises. I don't feel like IP has ever been a hindrance, except, and I think Rick, you hit on this, when you have an inventor, founder run company, it's very difficult, and I've lived this, and I've lived it firsthand, and I've lived it multiple times secondhand. It's very difficult for that inventor to know when is the time that they need to make the pivot and let go of their original idea and just start to build a business. And I said this many times, a lot of times that initial idea, the original patent on which a company was founded, becomes nothing more than a good excuse for having gotten started, right? But the company finds a business model, it finds a market opportunity, or it advances the technology in a direction that makes that original IP practically irrelevant, right? You put a good team in place and they can take a good idea and make it a great product, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be loyal to that original concept. But when the company is run by the inventor, that's a mission-oriented thing, and it's a very rare individual who can admit it's time to give up on their original idea and just build a business.
Yeah, one of the wisest bits I've heard. Sorry, Dr. Tom. Let me just
Good.
short point. One of the wisest bits I've heard is, really it's a startup company. So taking an original concept and becoming successful as a company is a relay race, because it's exactly Dave's point. Is that, the mindset that you need to pioneer a product and make it work in a first installation is a very different mindset, one that to streamline a manufacturing process, and very different mindset from a willingness to say no to opportunities, to turn down really bad opportunities, commercial opportunities, and just stick to what you're really good at. And a lot of times, very, very rare is the same team going to carry through all the stages of the development of a company. There are some terrific exceptions, but for the most part, it's going to be a handoff.
Yeah. I was just going to add a point which I think Eric mentioned it and was going to. IP is good, and that's the basis for your business and technology. But there is a point where, and there's a fine balance that you need to move out of the lab and start building a business, which means stop developing the IP and start building a business. Mm-hmm. And that's a very critical balance that you need.
All right, let me move through another couple of questions here. The next one is kind of I'm a small company. I have a technology solution, and its impact would most likely be felt by large industrial companies. How do I cross that bridge? Because inherently, my technology has a risk, and large companies don't want to have any risk in there. So any experiences or thoughts that you guys have on making that jump?
Yeah, I think get some traction in the market, get a pilot going, get your IP secured. There are a lot of corporates in our space that are looking for solutions just like yours. I think don't necessarily start the conversation from a an investment perspective. Really think about what does that larger company have that you don't have. They probably have a sales pipeline and team. They also have connections and piloting capabilities. So I think the whole model is changing around commercialization from the corporate angle in the water industry. And you see the likes of Xylem or Veolia standing up pretty significant open innovation labs. But I think be clear that they're not starting out with the investment discussion. They're really looking at what's out there in the market and who can they partner with.
I want to make 2 points though. Outside of municipal water and wastewater, it's not the water industry. It's the oil and gas industry. It's the food and beverage industry. It's the biopharma industry. It's the high-tech industry. Water is an input and it's a waste to be dealt with, but it's not their product, right? They're not in the water business. So that's one. Two, so water is an afterthought. It's supposed to come for free out of the sky and be perfectly clean, and they should be able to pay a minimal amount of money just to send it into the sewer. That's the mindset of industries historically. Right? So trying to convince them to do anything else is a real challenge. The other thing that I think a lot of entrepreneurs who are maybe not as experienced don't appreciate. When you're selling to a customer, and again, I've had a lot of firsthand experience with this, people are friendly. They don't want to be confrontational. They don't want to be mean. They want to be nice. They want people to like them. So you can have a conversation and you walk away from it and go, oh, I think we've got that customer. And meanwhile, that customer goes to lunch with his buddy, who's the salesman for big company X, who's selling the current solution that you're trying to displace. And they're talking about going out to dinner on Saturday night with their wives and playing golf on Sunday morning. You have no chance of disrupting that relationship. Zero, right? And that is one of the most important things about hiring and in the sales process, hiring people that are from not just the region, but they go to the church with the buy side people. Their kids play sports together, youth sports together. Their wives are friends. You have to find somebody in the community who has credibility, who isn't going anywhere. And if he says to his brother-in-law, look, this thing actually works, then his brother-in-law is going to say, okay, let's give it a shot, right? But if you're, LA boy going down to Louisiana trying to convince somebody to do anything, they're going to be real friendly, shake your hand, pat you on the back, and then kick you in the pants on your way home.
So,
Yeah,
Matt,
go ahead, Gautam.
Just a quick add. I mean, what I would say is a small company versus a big corporate. I think a small company has a lot of advantages because they're fast and nimble. Big corporates, they are slow. Once they have, it's very difficult for them to turn around, try new technologies. So small companies do have that advantage. I think what you should focus on is your value proposition. And if you can determine that and be able to talk about it, I think there's a good chance that you would win. And again, Eric mentioned that there are these industries, oil and gas, pharma, beverage, but I mean, they consider water as waste. And for them, cost becomes a big issue. And that's what you keep hearing about cost. And one of the reasons for that is, I mean, if you look at sort of the oil and gas industry, and if you look at oil production, I mean, if you look at the Permian, typically the oil to water ratios are 5-to-1. Which means that for every dollar that you spend treating water, you're adding $5 to the cost of oil production, which is a huge multiple. And that is why these industries are very focused on the cost. And if you can sort of prove that value proposition, you would find them listening to you.
I'm a little more cynical. I just say, I talked about that you have to, they won't line up at your door. So my experience, if you're two things you're looking for is bringing technology, bringing product to the market. One is, you're competing with bigs, established, commercial legacy, traditional technology, whatever. but you're also trying to sell, yeah, ideally an exit, a valid exit for your company is to be bought by one of these big system integrators. The only way I've ever been able to get them to pay attention to me is to steal their customers, to go to their customers and sell them a better solution to the point where their salespeople are like, hey, now what's going on here? And they've got to go back to their bosses and explain how they got scooped on a particular opportunity. So you got to beat them in their own game. Second is, to the extent you want to play in power or municipal, you got to go through engineering companies. And I love engineering companies. I love working with them, talking to them. They're smart, they're versatile. They will never bring in new technology. You have to go around them and get spec'd into a project by the end user. And again, otherwise they're just not gonna roll with you. So you've got to be aggressive.
Yeah, that was what in my previous role before I got to NREL, we would sell membrane systems for gas separation into chemical plants, right? And the medium person was always the engineering company. And if you didn't get spec'd in by the end person, the engineering company's like, and even then when they're evaluating you, they're saying, what the heck is this thing, right? And they've got two things that maybe they're going at it, and it takes time, but you're right that getting to that technology or the user at the end is really important. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question here, and then I think I want to briefly go into some short, like a thought from each of you guys on where opportunities might lie right now for people and innovation. Okay. One of the things I saw here, somebody had put a question, is there a good way to partner with governments or regulators to boost sales of a new product or solution for water sector? And one thing I wanted to point out for people is that, at least on the federal side, boosting sales, I mean, that's a tough one for the government to do. That being said, if you have an idea and you're trying to figure out ways to get funding to be able to move that idea through scaling phases, the SBIR program, it has its challenges. It's federally out there. You go through a very standard process, and they have topic areas that actually some of them have recently been connected with water. It's a good opportunity. Okay, it's different than working through some of the other incubators that are out there, but it's an opportunity space, and you can look through it by, many different organizations in the federal government go through SBIR. And for people with ideas that want to move them through, it's a good place to get started. So I wanted to put that out there just because that question was there. And I mean, I don't know, does anyone else have any comments on that particular question and any feedback that might go in?
I would add that, I think investors are generally going to be pretty skeptical of anything where there's some regulatory risk. Regulation obviously can create certainty, which you need in the market. But if you're pinning all your hopes on some regulation changing in the future, or everything's riding on a regulation that could be in jeopardy, that you've got a problem. You're not going to make it that far. You've got to really think about, again, what's the customer pain point? What are they going to pay for? You've got to really get back to the basic unit economics.
I've known at least one company that brought a product to market on the notion that the regulators were talking about dropping the level from here to here, and theirs would be the only technology that could get to here in terms of the water quality. And 15 years later, the government hadn't put forward the regulation. They invested all this money, and they had an overkill product. It did too much, and it cost more, and so it just was a mismatch for the market. So Scott, what you said, never bank on a future regulation coming to fruition.
Okay. All right. So we've got about 4 minutes here, and I was trying to think of the right way to kind of wrap up with the question for each of you all. And I was thinking, are there spaces where you think that there's ripe for innovation in the community right now? PFAS comes up a lot in the water community. Are there any like high level places where you think innovation is really needed? And I'm just going to go around and kind of start. Scott, what do you think? Is there anything that you might add to that tidbit?
As far as sectors, I think we've all got to kind of look into the crystal ball as best we can. There will be some kind of economic correction here. What industries are going to continue to grow in a recessionary environment? what are our needs going to be for energy? Are we going to see some kind of return for demand for water solutions from the energy sector? Food and bev, continued demand for water solutions. Semiconductors, tough space to enter, but I think you're starting to see more semiconductors actually invest in solutions and pilot themselves, and sometimes actually circumvent the consulting community. So looking for industries that need solutions yesterday. That's what I would say.
Yeah, well, semiconductor, apparently there's a funding bill that who knows if it ever gets through, but it passed the Senate yesterday. Now it needs to go to the House. So again, something to kind of watch the dynamics of. It would fund NSF at a level of, I can't remember the exact number. I think 50% of the funding in the hundreds of millions of dollars range would go to NSF. But you can read about that by searching online. I forget the name of it. All right, Rick, anything that you think on the opportunity space here?
Yeah, for sure. I think the combination to look for is where there's a market need and there's nothing that owns that market yet. So there's no major market shareholder. And I think brine concentration is an area that we're focusing on. PFAS is definitely another. Automation, just sort of broadly, you don't find a single company or even 2 or 3 companies out there owning more than 50% of the market. So that means there's opportunity for innovation. People are willing to try stuff. There's a strong demand and there's no, readily available solution. So I think that's where there's real opportunity for innovation, for new products, and for quick uptake on stuff. So
cool. Thanks, Rick. Eric, what are your thoughts?
I think for me, I have the luxury of, tenure and so I can say outrageous things. But I agree with what Rick said. I agree with what Scott said. I would say what I think is much more interesting is to think about what does the future look like 20, 30, 50 years from now? Are we still talking about wastewater treatment plants, or are we talking about biorefineries that use wastewater as a feedstock and produce biofuels, fertilizer, and clean water as a byproduct? They may be profit centers 30, 40, 50 years from now, as opposed to a hole in the balance sheet of a municipality. On the water side, I think water, there's a lot of talk about brine valorization and these kind of things. And it's very difficult because you have to have that magical combination of there's something in there at a sufficiently high concentration that it can be economically extracted. And you have to have a customer for it nearby. If you got to ship it 1,000 miles, it's never going to work. So I think there's more value in H2O molecules than people understand. And so I think in the future, you're going to see a desalination plant is going to be the vehicle for producing clean water to feed into an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen, which the cost of the desalination adds 1 penny to a kilogram of hydrogen produced. Imagine that, right? The whole cost of a desal plant is a rounding error on the profit margin of the real product, which is hydrogen, right? So I think there's going to be some paradigm shifts. It's not going to occur, next year, but people are working on it. People are talking about it. People are publishing on it. And I think that's a lot more interesting to me, is to think, what does the water industry look like in, 30, 40, 50 years? Is it a hydrogen and biorefining industry, right? That is producing clean water as a byproduct of these other higher value products being harvested and produced. So, thought experiment.
It's a great perspective, Eric. Thank you. And Gautam, as the ICC chair, is there anything you would like to leave the team with before we wrap up today? Leave this group with?
Yeah, and just looking at the future, Eric, it's not a thought experiment, but folks are looking at it. And I think that's an area where you're using the treatment of produced water to produce hydrogen. It's a promise that people are seriously looking at it, and there are companies working on it. I think that's a hot area. But yeah, talking about the ICC, and as I said, I encourage folks to connect with us. There is a lot of experience, and I think Jennifer has put her email in the chat, so you'll know how to connect with us. And we really look forward to hearing from you all. I think there's a lot of good work that's kept being done at NAWI. And looking forward to hearing from you all.
Great. Thanks, Gautam. All right, I want to leave everybody with one last thing, which is that for those of you, we have this NAWI community site that we've created that my colleague Jennifer is managing. It is a great platform for connecting people with ideas. All right. So you can look for people, you can find folks you've seen here and connect there. And it's a good way to build and kind of get around an idea that you may have. So I want to encourage you to do that. And if you're not on that site, you can send a note to Jennifer. Her email's in there and she'll help you out. And with that, I'm going to wrap up today. I thank all of our panelists. Rick, I just want to call out that this is the first one that you've been on, and I really appreciate you joining and sharing your perspective, and Eric for connecting us. Scott, I know you did a lot of work kind of coordinating this, and I thank you a lot for that. And Gautam, as our ICC chair, we appreciate all of you and the time that you've put into NAWI. So everyone enjoy the rest of your week. There, as we said, the webinar recording will be up for you to look at. And that's it. We're signing off. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.